Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to this week's policy discussion on what COVID-19 means for higher education. My name is Sophie Trinietsky, and I'm the Campus Program Fellow here at the Network of Enlightened Women, and we're so excited to be joined by Lindsey Burke today to talk about what COVID-19 means for higher education. So thank you so much, Lindsey.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sophie.
Yeah, absolutely. Lindsey is the director of the Center of Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Lindsey oversees the foundation's research and policy on issues pertaining to preschool, K through 12, and higher education reform. Burke's commentary, research, and op-eds have appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers. So we're very excited to have you here to talk about this very relevant topic. So through the CARES Act, I know there's been a lot of talk about these hidden policies that are thrown into it that aren't necessarily related to coronavirus and actually solving and taking steps forward to what we need to be doing. So what are some policies that are hidden in this act that affect higher education and us students that are in college?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would take a step back. If we think about the CARES Act generally, if we think about federal spending in the coronavirus period, any spending at the federal level, it needs to be targeted and temporary and tied to the virus. So that's, I think, a good overarching framework to use when we're thinking about spending at the federal level. Unfortunately, what we've seen so far doesn't really fit that bill. If you look just at the education spending, it's been a tremendous amount of ed spending already. The CARES Act had about $30 billion in it for K-12 through higher education. Higher ed got about $14 billion of that in the CARES Act package. And what is interesting is that could just be really the first slice that we see. We're already hearing Congress talk about a potential phase 4 package, stimulus package. And so, will we see more? We're seeing special interest groups ask for hundreds of billions of dollars more for education. And so this could just be the tip of the iceberg. And I'll just say quickly on higher ed spending, if, and that's a big if, there's going to be another phase 4 package that provides more spending at the federal level, there shouldn't be a bailout. But if there is going to be more spending, that money really should be student-centered and not institutional. So we shouldn't be bailing out universities and bailing out K-12 schools. If there's going to be funding, it needs to go to the student and not physical colleges and universities.
Yeah, I agree. Many students my age, going off of that, are talking about how excited they are about laying debt. We're graduating in the midst of this. They're like, call it quits. We're done. No more debt. So what are the consequences to actually doing this? And why is this an inappropriate response to coronavirus?
Yeah, in general. So I think it really does go back to this targeted and temporary and tied to the virus. And we have heard for a long time special interest groups push to just have student loan debt forgiven. And of course, it isn't just forgiven. It doesn't just go into the ether and disappear. Taxpayers pick up the tab when that happens. And I think for a lot of people, people tend to forget that we're still in the minority with college degrees, right? About 2/3 of Americans don't have a bachelor's degree. And so when the federal government says, oh, we'll do loan forgiveness, that means that 2/3 of Americans who don't have bachelor's degrees end up paying off the college degrees of their college-going counterparts, which will presumably make more than them down the road. With coronavirus, it's a, I think, specific situation. We shouldn't have loan forgiveness, I think, at all. The question on the table now is, should colleges think about partial refunds to students who enrolled and paid tuition? If a student enrolled in a full-time brick and mortar university and they're paying $50,000 a year, and all of a sudden they can't access their housing or their professors in person or get the experience overall that they paid for, do they have an argument to make that they should get a partial refund? I think there's more solid ground for that, right, than any sort of loan forgiveness policy at the federal level. Colleges could think about providing some sort of partial refund, maybe a prorated amount, making up the difference between what they might charge normally for an online class versus a sort of regular in-person class. So that seems to be where the conversation's headed right now, more than loan forgiveness. And I should say, on the CARES Act, what the CARES Act did do in that phase 3 package was it said no interest will accrue on your student loans during the pandemic for the next 6 months or so. And it also suspended student loan payments. And that's appropriate, right? If you lose your job or, whatever financial hardship might befall someone as a result of the pandemic, putting a pause on their student loan payments makes sense. But we shouldn't forgive those payments. They should just pick back up when the economy picks back up.
Yeah, that sounds like a much more reasonable response. And
Yeah.
as for having the universities refund partial tuition because of us going online, is that a policy that would have to be implemented by each university individually, or is that
Yeah.
something that the government could choose to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think for state universities, that's something that states would have to think about. Universities have boards of regents and trustees. And so if you're a public, flagship state university, that's something that the state's going to have to think through. If you are a private university, that of course is up to the individual university to think about how they want to deal with those payments moving forward. But, I think the bottom line right now is colleges are going to have to get creative. They are hurting financially as a result of two things, right? Both the pandemic, but also just longstanding, one could say, bad financial decisions that some universities have made. Moody's, the investment services firm, recently downgraded the outlook for higher education, which will make it more to negative, which will make it more difficult for universities to borrow and to get credit. So that's going to impact their bottom line. Reductions in tax revenue will impact their bottom line because of state appropriations, potential reductions in students enrolling, although we could see the opposite, right? And we know in bad economies, students tend to go back to school. So they could end up seeing an influx of students come. But overall, conventional wisdom is they're going to really need to think creatively and adjust their budgets moving forward to survive in this new market. And it might look like combining campuses and sharing faculty resources and moving more options online.
Yeah, that's true. I think we're going to have a lot of changes that we see with this. And I guess that brings me to my next question. Do you think that smaller class sizes and more remote learning are something that we're going to start seeing more of once this is over? Or is this the new normal?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, I think that we'll see smaller class sizes by way of staggering class sessions a little bit more. So, more staggering of morning and afternoon classes. There should be no colleges right now that have empty buildings. That's often something that we see, right? Like in the pre-coronavirus environment, you would often see colleges where buildings were just empty because nobody wanted to go to class on Fridays, right? So that's something that's going to have to change, right? If we want to spread out the number of people in a class, we're going to have to make sure that faculty or resources, buildings, et cetera, are all being used appropriately. I do think we'll see more of that shift to online classes. I could envision a world where, all of the freshman students at a university do their first year online, for example, to free up space. So I do think it will get creative. I think we'll see class size reductions, but more as a function of sort of staggering class times than anything else. Maybe students going later, students going earlier. Right now, universities really should think about doing over the summer as much of that first year coursework as they possibly can over the summer online as well. So really getting creative.
Yeah, for sure. So, in addition to that and the economic impact that we're going to see, do you foresee coronavirus impacting higher education in ways that none of us are even talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's always difficult to predict, exactly, what the unknown might be, right? It's the reason it's unknown, but I think that broadly there are a couple of areas where we're likely to see some changes that we can't really conceptualize at the moment, but things like athletics. I mean, athletics, it's hard right now to envision going into a full stadium around all of your peers and rooting for the football team, like with thousands of other people. That's just really difficult to envision coming back in the near term. So I think that, the athletic component is something that's going to change. We're all getting much more used to doing things online despite the occasional technical difficulty, right? So I think as we all get better and better at doing that, I think long term we're going to see just much more facility with students and professors engaging online and having that online mentorship in a way that they hadn't before. I think that the more creative aspect of higher ed's potential restructuring is going to be in that resource sharing piece. So, maybe you attend a small private university that can't afford an entire department of Greek history or whatever it might be. That university sharing professors virtually with the large flagship university that does have a professor of Greek history. So I think sharing in creative ways like that is something that we'll see much more frequently moving forward.
It's encouraging because it sounds like a lot of these seem like positives rather than negatives. So that's good.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, higher education has needed a shakeup for a long time. This is not the way that anyone wanted to get there. But I do think that it will force some creative solutions moving forward. And, there's some things that could come out of this that are to the benefit of students. Maybe it will look like things that sound really boring and wonky, but are really important, like accreditation reform that could really help a student access a bachelor's degree much quicker than they currently do and enter the workforce much more quickly. So hopefully that is a silver lining, that we'll see some long-term meaningful systemic reform, even though it was catalyzed in a way that nobody would have wanted to have happen.
Yeah, that's true. So my team's sending me in some questions now.
Great.
So they say, what can we do to stop the inflation spiral of college costs post-coronavirus?
Yes, this is always a big one. And the answer may seem a bit counterintuitive, but the answer to reining in college costs is to significantly reduce the amount of federal subsidies that are out there right now. We have seen federal spending on higher education increase fourfold since the 1980s. It has increased faster than the cost of inflation. It has increased faster than the cost of increases in healthcare. And I would argue, and a lot of others would argue, that a big part of the reason is that we subsidize these universities at the federal level with virtually unlimited federal spending. And this, of course, came to be known as the Bennett hypothesis, right? That the more you subsidize at the federal level, the more universities will increase tuition. They capture those subsidies. It sends students scrambling back for more student loans, and you create this vicious lending and spending cycle. You end up with, a facilities arms race with a fancier and fancier climbing wall and a lazy river and a tiger grotto, right? Like whatever it might be. So the way that you actually work to put downward pressure on those prices is to pull back all of those federal subsidies, to eliminate a lot of the federal student loan programs, but to make space for private lending to reemerge. And private lending is important for all kinds of reasons, but not the least of which is it can provide loan terms to borrowers that reflect things that a market finds important, right? Like your ability potentially to repay your loan. Things that we wouldn't want the federal government making decisions around, but a private lending market could. And so doing that would go a long way. So cutting out two specific things, the Parent Plus loan and the Grad Plus loan. So right now, grad students can borrow almost an unlimited amount of money. It's up to the cost of attendance at the federal level through Grad Plus. And then parents can borrow for their undergrad student through the Parent Plus program. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the Grad Plus program in particular is what's driving a lot of these increases in college costs. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York a few years ago had a study that they put out that said for every additional dollar in subsidized student loans, universities raised tuition 60 cents. So that was some pretty clear evidence of the Bennett hypothesis really turning into this Bennett truism, right? The more we spend at the federal level, the more colleges spend profligately.
When I was doing research on my loans for law school, I was shocked by the way that the Grad Plus loan worked. And basically, like what you were saying, that like there was no limit on how much they were allowing me to take out.
Exactly. Yeah. Law school and medical school in particular. And, it's a really good example, Sophie, because if you think about law school, right, and medical school, often people will say, well, if you get rid of the federal student loan programs, how are students going to get student loans? Will the private market really provide what's needed? But if you think about someone going to law school or to medical school, the private market is absolutely going to step up and provide them a student loan. These are students who are highly likely, the evidence shows us, to be able to repay those loans. They're going to be high earners down the road. So that makes sense. The question becomes, well, could a student who wants to major in, underwater sociology or whatever, like funny thing we can make up, would they get a favorable rate in the private market? And probably not, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So there's a lot there in the lending market that could be reformed to really drive down costs long term.
Yeah, that's a great point. What impact do you think that these talks on what the CARES Act actually has and these policies impact on students that otherwise would be working to pay off their loans earlier versus like waiting?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's just sort of a normative issue right now. So students should be working to repay their loans. The CARES Act says during the pandemic, you don't have to repay your loans for a few months. You can pause them, put them on hold, and interest won't accrue. If you've lost your job or face financial hardships, that makes a lot of sense as an emergency reform that's targeted and temporary, right? It checks all of those boxes. If you haven't lost your job and things are still pretty good for you, during the pandemic, it makes much more sense to continue making those payments on your student loan so that you do, because right now you're basically just paying toward principal, which is fantastic. So if you are able to pay during this time, this is a really good time to be paying them down.
And then, do you think that it's realistic that a debt relief plan is going to be put in place that will eventually have a policy that gets through Congress with student loans?
Well, I laugh only because we almost have an abundance of debt relief plans at the moment. And I think that's part of the problem is right now there are 5 different types of repayment plans that Congress has put into place basically since the Obama years. Income-based repayment plans, income-driven repayment, income contingent repayment plans. There are all these plans at the federal level that reflect a student needing to make proportional payments down the road if they face hardships. And then there is the loan forgiveness that's already in place. Your student loans get forgiven after 20 years, no matter what. If you enter public service, right, if you work for the government, or your loans can get forgiven after 10 years. So there is already, I would argue, over generous forgiveness plans in place. And again, of course, that all gets sent back over to the taxpayer rather than the individual who benefited from the education that they received. So we need to think, as a student, someone has entered a contract, they have agreed, they've signed on a dotted line to take out a loan and to repay it, and they should be responsible for repaying those loans.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the more policies like this that we implement, why would you be
Right.
encouraged to even work harder to pay off of it? And I think it takes away from the work ethic of it all.
Yeah, and it's not to say people won't try down the road. Like, for sure, they will try to make these plans even more generous. But we have to think about the unintended consequences of doing that and the trillions of dollars in debt that are currently out there right now, and the debt that we will load onto future generations if we keep doing this.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
This was super informational for me to hear, and I'm sure all the other college students that are a part of our network and those that also tuned in. So thank you all for watching, and be sure to tune into our next policy talk coming soon.
Thanks for having me.